Welcome to Nothing Personal. I'm your host, Spencer Dimitros, and I'm here with my co-host, Aaron McBee today. We're going to be talking about the recent U.S. Supreme Court case that held unconstitutional the affirmative action plans in college admissions at Harvard and University of North Carolina. And we're also going to talk about the new lawsuits that this case has spurred in the employment realm. But before we get to that, we have to resolve a burning question that's directed at Aaron. So how are you doing with your Christmas shopping?
I guess I'm fine.
Did you start it?
Yeah, I got my parents a couple of t-shirts this summer that I thought they would like. But I don't have a lot of people to buy for.
Oh, really?
Because a lot of the family members are older and,
Yeah.
get them a gift card or,
Yeah.
and I already bought Sam, my son, his Christmas present. So
Awesome.
now I'm like, I guess stocking stuffers or,
Do you
yeah.
do-
And I'm going out of town, so it makes it a little tricky too.
Oh,
So.
where are you going?
To Texas, so.
See the
We've got
family?
my in-laws and my parents are there, and yep.
So you're not doing a Christmas tree?
No, we have a tree, a Norway, I think it's a Norway spruce that somebody handed down to us that we decorate. But yeah, we're not doing the real Christmas tree because I just finished cleaning up the needles from last year and the year before, I think. So, and we
Well,
won't
that's
be
good.
there. What about you guys?
So we do a tree. It's kind of a source of stress in our house. It starts with the selection of the tree.
Yeah.
It's funny, Catherine, she's contrary to the stereotypical woman who fusses over the tree. We go to a tree farm and within a minute she gets bored and just picks whatever tree is there and she's like, let's get this one. And it's like, no, half.
Because they all kind of look the same after a while, maybe.
They
I don't
do,
know.
but you
Yeah.
have to kind of turn it around.
Yeah,
and
you
sometimes
do.
they're completely barren on one side, but she's
Yeah.
okay with that.
Yeah.
But the real stress comes when we put it up. And she and I actually are good about putting it up together. We have a good stand. It's all very...
Our stand's horrible.
Is it really?
Yeah, we're constantly having to tweak it and then it falls over. We tweak it again.
Yeah. But for us, it's the... Do you have cats? I don't remember.
Oh, yeah, we do. We got 2 cats, so that's the whole thing, too.
Do they pull the ornaments off?
Yeah, only the breakable ones, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, or the ones that are made out of felt. I have these really cute felted ones,
Right.
and they love those. And then they try to drink the water, and you put that stuff in the water so your tree won't die. So you
Yeah.
have to
It's toxic.
not put the stuff in it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you still have cats? Did you get more
Yeah,
cats?
we have 2, and one
Yeah.
of them kind of will poke at an ornament every so often, but the other one is just she's vicious with them, and she's a really sweet cat, but she just loves the ornaments. So, as the days go on, we move the ornaments higher and higher in the tree, and she usually can knock it over at least once per holiday season.
Usually 2 in the morning or something is what we found. Yeah.
Yes, you hear the crash.
Yeah.
And then within a week or two, the tree looks completely beat up and it's barren from the midsection down. And
Yeah, and
anyway.
you're like, yeah.
Well, why don't we jump into our topic for today? So on June 29th, the Supreme Court came down with a landmark case that created huge upheaval in college admissions offices around the country. In a 6-3 decision that fell along the political leanings of the justices, the court struck down longstanding affirmative action plans at Harvard and the University of North Carolina that gave racial preferences to Black and Hispanic applicants. More recently, conservative activist groups have been using this case, which obviously is in the college arena, to attack diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, so-called DEI programs, by filing lawsuits against private employers. These plaintiffs are arguing that the prohibition against giving one race an advantage over another should apply the same way, whether you're talking about college admissions or employment. And therefore, DEI programs that give racial preferences should be stricken as unconstitutional. But before we get into those newly filed cases, I'd like to just recap the key points of the Harvard, North Carolina case. So the plaintiff in that case was a nonprofit called Students for Fair Admissions, whose stated purpose is to defend human and civil rights, including equal protection under the law. Chief Justice Roberts delivered the opinion of the court in which the court held that considering race as a factor in college admissions violates the 14th Amendment that guarantees each person equal protection of the laws. The court started by summarizing key legal decisions under the Equal Protection Clause that establish that in matters like education, busing, and housing, it's illegal to treat a person of one race differently from a person of another race. But of course, this begs the question, if you can never treat one race differently than another, then how can there be any argument in favor of affirmative action? The answer is the Supreme Court established an exception to the arguably race-blind mandate of the Equal Protection Clause. But in order to qualify for the exception, first, there must be a compelling reason for treating one race differently than another. In this case, according to Harvard and University of North Carolina, the compelling reason was to cultivate a rich academic environment with a broad range of perspectives. And second, the action must be narrowly tailored and necessary to achieve the compelling interest. However, in this case, the court held that Harvard and UNC failed to meet either part of the test. First, the court decided that the, quote, compelling interest advanced by the schools didn't hold up, that there was insufficient evidence that admitting more Black or Latino students resulted in a measurable improvement in the ideas being exchanged by students, or that there were more diverse perspectives being shared by the student body. In fact, the court reasoned that the idea that Black or Hispanic students have a particular perspective because of their race is, in and of itself, offensive racial stereotyping. Another problem identified by the court was that in trying to achieve racial diversity, Harvard and University of North Carolina used racial categories that were overbroad, under-inclusive, or just arbitrary. For example, under the category of, quote, Asian, they lumped together East Asians, like Chinese applicants, with South Asians, like applicants from India. Also, there was no category for Middle Eastern students. In addition, there was no clear definition of the term Hispanic. Another big concern raised by the court was that the affirmative action plans breach the principle that race can never be used as a factor that decreases someone's chances of getting admitted to a college. And in this case, the evidence showed a decrease in the number of Asians getting admitted, at least into Harvard. And Harvard's and University of North Carolina's main response to these criticisms was, according to the court, just trust us. But the court said, while universities get some deference in how they admit students, the court still has to apply strict scrutiny when it comes to constitutional rights potentially being violated. One thing I thought was interesting was the fact that the position of the justices kind of fell along party lines. And what's interesting about that is, the mandate of the judicial branch is to apply the law to the facts of the case with no regard to, personal preferences, biases, and certainly not political predispositions. But it looks like that's exactly what happened in terms of the decision in this case. So, we're both lawyers. How do you feel about it? Do you feel like this is going to cause, some cynicism on the part of the American people when looking at this decision and maybe even other decisions by the court?
Yeah, I mean, in the context of the prior decisions, like the one with the Clean Water Act, and I believe it's the Clean Water Act and the wetlands decision that came out recently, and then all of the ethics questions with, Justice Thomas, and I think Sotomayor, of people getting gifts from potential influencers, I guess I'll call them, that there's a lot of people are kind of questioning, are these people really as independent as they seem, especially with some of the appointments in the last administration and how those went, and they were very, very partisan. To the point that the American Bar Association's recommendations weren't even really consulted. The process was so different, it seemed, than before, and much more tense. A lot more. And so when you have a decision like this where I kind of looked at this and I thought, why did they even grant it cert? Why this? And that everybody's going to have their own unique perspective, and that's why we appoint the judges we appoint, because it's not only that we want them to be a fair arbiter, but we know that they all have different backgrounds and we want them to put their take on it, and we're hoping that they're representative of the people, which is why we have affirmative action, I think, too, in the schools. But with the Supreme Court, they're supposed to be, at the top and looking at everything somewhat impartially. Like, they're supposed to be able to try to step back and, and look at things impartially, which is sometimes hard to do.
Well, particularly when you think about the three branches of the government. Congress, they're elected. You know, they are members of various political parties that we kind of expect them to be partisan.
Yeah.
And the same thing with the executive branch, right? The president, vice president. The judicial branch, they're supposed to be the check and balance. And, you know, in this case, you know, obviously they kind of fell along their political leanings, and as you said, coincided with, you know, who appointed them. You know, and that's not to say that they're both wrong. You know, it's, you know, I believe there's objective truth. And, you know, if you kind of dispassionately apply the law, then you should, the outcome should coincide with the actual truth. So it's not that they're both wrong, you know, for doing that. It's that one of them is wrong.
Oh, funny.
That's interesting. You know what I mean? In other words, let's, you know, it's like, you know, let's look at the law on this, and
Yeah.
I guess, you know, the question is, which one is wrong?
Yeah, I feel like there's so much gray that there really isn't an objective truth necessarily. I mean, we're trying to get to the point where, you know, where, I mean, you try to discern as much of you can of what we think the truth and the reality is and what the way things should be, but we're often wrong, especially in retrospect. So yeah, we try to do our best, but I feel that nobody can be truly objective. Everybody's got their bias, even if you don't know it. You know, it's there somewhere.
Right. I think that's
yeah.
right.
Yeah.
I think when it's 6-3, though, it's beyond that little shade of
and
bias.
Some of the language that was used, I went through this because I felt, you know, like I just wanted to look through it again, and I was, you know, as an attorney, I was a bit captivated, of course, right?
Yeah.
But some of the language that was used, I was a little surprised, like using the term elite over and over again, and, you know, some of the insults that kind of went back and forth. It was a little catty almost.
It's almost like the Justice Department is falling prey to what the rest of our society is. Things are just are getting quite a little bit, maybe a little less civil.
Yeah, and I just remember, you know, Scalia came and spoke at my law school, and I remember there was a lot. He and Ginsburg, you know, are on opposite sides of many issues. They had different interpretations, but they got along and they found a way to work together. And I'm just not seeing that as much here. You know, I mean, I feel like they're trying, but it just seems like things are a little bit, you know,
a little more heated. Yeah. You mentioned you thought it was interesting that they granted cert in this case. So why don't you explain what your concern was? And for those that don't know what that means, what cert means. Yeah,
the court in October will decide, they'll announce what cases they're going to take on to hear. And then those cases will be the ones that we get the decisions on. And so they usually are picking things where there's a dispute between circuit courts, you know, where there's two top courts in different regions of the country who have a dispute and there's an issue that's unresolved.
Right. So you're saying it was interesting that they granted cert in this case because
I didn't see that there was any conflict between different decisions coming from different parts of the country. It didn't seem like a new issue. It seemed like a very similar issue to what they've already decided in past cases. So that I thought was kind of strange. And then when you mentioned, as I think Sotomayor in her dissent mentioned, we're supposed to not be the fact finders. You know, we're supposed to, you know, be the people that make the judgment after the laws are passed, and we make sure we interpret them, I guess, so to speak. The fact finder was the lower court. And in her opinion, they didn't give any deference to the lower court who was charged with the fact finding, and she felt that that was a little lacking. Yeah,
I think that one of the things they raised, though, which was kind of unique, was that in this case, the affirmative action plan, at least in Harvard, and I think I mentioned this earlier, actually had a negative impact on one of the racial minorities,
that was also disputed in the dissent. But they argued that the percentage of Asian Americans, which was, you know, the categories are somewhat arbitrary, but that's what the feds use. That I think that their percentages had gone down, I think was part of the finding.
Issue.
Although Sotomayor took that apart and said, no, that's not the case. When I guess it was California and Michigan they basically banned affirmative action, and they found that the numbers for Asian Americans and other minorities went down during those years when they didn't have it. Now, I mean, it's kind of hard to know what's objectively the truth in that, but that was those were the numbers that she brought.
It's interesting. You mentioned Sotomayor. In her dissent, I think her dissent kind of goes to the heart of what the criticism of the majority's opinion is, and what she was basically saying was, you know, in the majority, they argue or Justice Roberts says that we really have to be colorblind. That in deciding admissions for college and maybe even in the employment context, you can't give an edge to one race over another. You have to be colorblind. And that's what the Constitution requires. That's what the 14th Amendment says, that everybody has to be treated equally. And that means you don't give deference to one race over another, even if that one race was discriminated against or had horrendous treatment for decades or centuries.
And that was kind of the heart of their dispute, was that, basically, because in her opinion and the other dissenters, the 14th Amendment was set up after slavery with the intent. And so she goes into all, as you read, all those details of, well, this person said this and this drafter said that. And
I think the point, her main point though, was that, the Equal Protection Clause that provides equal protection under the laws, that the drafters specifically use language of equality and not colorblindness. And I think what she was saying was that in order to truly treat people equally, sometimes you have to look at color because they kind of didn't start out with they weren't dealt the same hand to begin with.
Yeah.
And in order to have equal opportunities and equality, sometimes you have to give a lift to a member of one race or another. I think maybe the counter out to that is, but you can't fix those problems by mandating some advantage of one race over another. So I don't know. What were your thoughts on her kind of argument there about the fact that the Equal Protection Clause does not require necessarily colorblindness, just that everybody has some equal treatment?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with her dissent in many ways, because the colorblind is just kind of, with the way things are, there's so many other factors that disadvantage people, right? And it isn't just your race. And then, people might not look like the race that they identify with. And so, there's this whole gray area with that. And I thought that the whole point of the Equal Protection Clause was the equality and making sure that those people who had been formerly enslaved would not have a disadvantage when we had after the Civil War. But then it, permutated into what we have now. And because it wasn't just the African Americans who were slaves, it was also, we had people who were brought in from China and were treated very badly. And it was also people who used to be Mexican citizens and then were Texans and then were United States citizens whose land was taken. So it's, it's kind of evolved, it seems, to cover. But I think when they drafted it, it was based on the Constitution and it was all men. It wasn't based on race, I mean, they went back to the Constitution to come up with that.
But, I mean, I think a lot of people wouldn't, or most people wouldn't dispute that certain races or ethnic groups had it tougher than others. And, particularly African Americans. They came into this country when unwillingly as slaves. And of course, there were effects that continued for decades, centuries to this day. But can you fix that with something other than non-discrimination in the legal context? Can you fix that by trying to balance the scales, by giving one race an advantage over another? And does that work? I wonder if it does. I doubt that it does.
Yeah,
I think that perpetuates, when you start treating races differently, I feel like that perpetuates.
Which is what Thomas, I think, was bringing forward. Yeah. I feel like reparations would have been much more effective if the 40 acres and a mule would have actually been given to folks. I think we'd be in a totally different position, but people might have been given land and then it's taken away. Oh, 40 acres and a mule after, during Reconstruction, there was a promise, I think, I forget which general it was, that all the former slaves would be given 40 acres and a mule so they could pick themselves up and get started out there in the world, and they were not given the 40 acres and a mule. In fact, there were many communities, like in Oklahoma and other places where there would be a thriving African American community post-Reconstruction, and then it would be burned down and destroyed. Or, there was the GIs who came after World War II, came back to the U.S., and the people who weren't African American were given much better deals for financing and weren't prohibited from living in certain neighborhoods. So there's all these other things that kind of built up over.
Well, I mean, I think, I think there are people who are absolutely opposed to reparations here
Yeah,
in the year,
there are.
in the year
There are,
2023. But I think a lot of those
what
folks.
would they be?
What?
What would it be? That's a question.
I mean,
Did you see what happened in California?
Billions,
though? It was
trillions
amazing.
of dollars. I don't know.
There was a family in California who had property right on the coast,
Mm-hmm.
and the land had been taken away by basically, I think it was the city or the state of California.
Mm-hmm.
So years later, people tracked down what happened, and the city actually voted to give the land back to the descendants.
Oh, interesting.
It was amazing.
Yeah.
And they did that in Texas too with
Right.
folks of Mexican heritage whose land was taken away. So they now have the proceeds from gas and oil fields. They get some of those proceeds as part of a settlement years ago.
Yeah.
But that's not to
interesting.
say that that's going to make everything right
No,
or
it's
put
not going
everybody.
to make everything right. And I think that,
Yeah.
I think there are plenty of people who would say, yeah, reparations might have made sense right at the time when the slaves were freed, but it's not gonna work now. I guarantee you there are folks out there. In fact, probably some of my ancestors would say, I'm of Greek heritage,
Mm-hmm.
right? When we Greeks came, it was
Mm-hmm.
it was considered the new immigration, right? It was
I have
it was-
Italian heritage and
Okay,
Irish.
same
and,
thing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So the Irish, I guess, were the first wave. Greeks and Italians were the second wave. And my grandfathers have said this. When we came over, we had nothing. We were
No.
poor, and they used to, make fun of them.
And they were
Greeks.
discriminated against.
They were discriminated against.
Yeah.
They were called grease balls. And my grandfather would say, I would have to sell candy bars on the street, and my other grandfather, he cleaned hats with like benzene and all kinds of nasty
Oh, wow.
chemicals.
Wow.
So I think there's folks
And then
out
there was those Italians that were hung in the 20s or the 1910s, and then that led to Columbus Day being established.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of folks would say, every group that came into this country at some point, most of them were the victims of discrimination, but you just gotta do your best, pull yourself, it's the bootstrap argument.
Yeah. But then you can make the argument that they came by choice, although if they were experiencing a famine, what kind of choice did they have? But then again, they did come by, of their own volition.
Well, that's
But
true.
they did face a lot of barriers of entry, for sure.
They faced a lot of barriers, and they did what they had to. So you mentioned Justice Thomas's concurring opinion. He raises an interesting point. And for those who don't know, so a concurring opinion is one of the justices who agrees with the majority's conclusion, but either has something to add to kind of the basis for the actual decision.
And they're really illuminating because you can see why they concurred.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. They are very, and his was as well. But his point was that affirmative action doesn't just, potentially hurt like the Asians in this case, or the white people who aren't going to be the beneficiaries of affirmative action, but they actually can also hurt the groups that it was intended to benefit. He says, for example, there's a stigma attached to black students and Hispanic students who do well and actually get into some of the more elite colleges that everybody just assumes they got there because of affirmative action. And he says that's not fair to them because the vast majority of them got there purely on grounds of merit, and they'll never get over that. And I thought that was a valid point. What did you think about that?
Yeah, when I went to University of Texas, I lived in a co-op which was the cheapest housing on campus.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of folks who were there for, that did get into the school either because they were in the top 10% of their class from a small community or that they were a minority. And some of them did well and some of them, struggled. And they definitely, we would talk about, what the issues they faced, on campus. There was a lot of mistrust initially until some of my roommates got to know me about sharing their experiences. There was some reluctance to share, how they really were treated on campus. And yeah, definitely it would come out sometimes. Sometimes in debates in class, people would say something about, oh, you only got in because of whatever. And it wasn't always true. And even if it was true, if, you're able to do the work, then so much the better. But yeah, there could be a stigma. But then again, you could say, well, okay, maybe you have stigma for 4 years, but then once you're out of school, you're done and you're out in the world and you're working. And
or you could say, people grumble about everything, right?
Yeah, you could say it about women too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, oh,
Yeah.
you know, she got where she was, she slept her way to the top,
Yep.
whatever, you know.
Yeah, yeah. And now I don't know if,
Yeah.
when you look at the standards that Harvard and UNC applied, I mean, those schools are both very competitive.
Yeah.
And it looks like they didn't consider the race factor until they'd already looked at all these other factors like academic, you know, ability or SATs or schools grades and where the kids went to school and what classes they took. Now, I'm not saying that's for every school. Obviously, this
Yeah.
is Harvard and,
Right.
you know, UNC, but that seemed to be that these students they felt would be able to do well in the school, and they have so many applicants now,
Yeah.
you know. So I don't know if
Yeah.
that's as much of an issue as it used to be.
I think that's a valid point that, you know, it wasn't like they took somebody who, you know, wouldn't have had any chance of getting in. You know, it was more just kind of a little bit of a bump.
Yeah.
Which
Now,
I guess
when
goes,
it comes to athletics, it's totally different.
That's true.
You know, at University of Texas, which is a big football school,
Yeah.
they had a separate support system for students who had learning differences or who were struggling in school to make sure those athletes weren't just left, you know, without any support because they had so many practices on top of
Right.
some of them not having the grades that the other students might have had
Right.
to get in.
Yeah. He made another point too about, you know, the effect on the minority students that were the beneficiaries. And he said, and I guess this goes to kind of the point you were making, it kind of refutes, or you're refuting what he was saying, was that the ones that get in not by their own merit actually struggle when they get in, or they can struggle. Because
if they were given a leg up due solely to their race.
exactly.
Yeah. I mean, they had merit, you know, I don't think, but
you know, that they were
yeah.
okay, you know, that they were smart kids.
Yeah.
But maybe they are going to have a lot more of a challenge if they get to one of the really top competitive schools. Whereas if they went to, you know, a school that they got in purely on their own merit, then they would have, you know, they would have a much higher likelihood of succeeding.
Yeah.
In fact, you know, your son and my kids we're all in the college selection application process.
Fun stuff.
And I talked to a consultant, and I had asked her, I said, you know, if one of my kids gets into like one of their like super stretch schools, just by luck, you know, the school that was just thought, oh, no way they're going to get in, but actually get in, would I be crazy to like say to them, you're probably better off not going there because you're going to be, you know, really challenged and maybe a little, you know, kind of fighting an uphill battle throughout your time there. And she said, no, that's not crazy. She said, you want your kid to be in the top quartile of whatever school they get into. You don't want them going in at the bottom quartile. That affects their self-esteem and their confidence and everything else. So,
Yeah.
you know, I think that kind of goes to his point, which is, you know, maybe you're not doing these kids a favor.
Yeah, I mean, maybe for other schools, but I don't see that with Harvard and, you know, like the University of Texas at Austin or the,
Yeah.
you know, the big school at UNC. I feel like they get so many applicants and they're able to just bring everybody up that's, you know, equal on other factors and then consider the race. I think with athletes, though, it's definitely an issue. I did feel that when I was a student at UT, I didn't really know a lot of the facts about the sports team, but you always felt like they were just recruiting people whether they could compete at school or do the work because they were good football players. And I
Yeah.
felt like that was a disservice to those folks because what if they had an injury?
Yeah.
What would the school do then? I mean, I don't know, but
Right.
so I can see
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, there's also an argument too that, you know, once you're in a school that's a little bit more academically rigorous, you know, you're around smarter kids, you rise to
Yeah.
the occasion, right?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. You push yourself a little harder.
Yeah.
That was why I went to that school. I went to a smaller state school and I didn't feel like that it was as rigorous as I wanted. So I transferred to the harder school. I could have started at the harder school, but I was afraid it would be that experience where, am I really ready for this?
Yeah.
You know, especially with a large school.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But when I went to law school, I did the opposite. You know, I did apply to the larger schools, but then I got a scholarship. And so I said, well, the decision was made for me there.
Yeah.
But it was a small school where, you know, they recruited me because of geographic diversity.
Yeah.
So,
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, that when you mentioned diversity, that raises another question. So in the decision, you know, the compelling interest that was advanced by Harvard and University of North Carolina was based, and I'm paraphrasing obviously, that by bringing in more people from different racial groups, you're going to have a more diversity of perspectives, and there'll just be a richer educational environment because you're going to have a lot more different views on things. And Justice Roberts disagreed with that and said, no, I mean, that kind of assumes that, people think similarly according to race.
Yeah, he said that was racist, so to speak. He didn't say it was racist, but he said it was stereotyping.
Yeah, exactly.
Folks. Yeah,
and
that
it was very kind of almost insulting.
Yeah, yeah.
And I thought that was interesting. And maybe the solution is, you do want diverse perspectives, but maybe, and I think he suggested this, or one of them, maybe it was even in one of the concurring and dissenting, was, to get different perspectives, you look at geographical, like what you said, geographical diversity, or just differences in people's life experiences, or people's different interests or hobbies. So I thought that was an interesting perspective.
But when it comes to race, I feel like our history of our ancestry, I mean, we have that with us. So it does give us a little bit of a different perspective, whether we realize it or not. Even if, if you were somebody whose family did really, really well, and so that perspective of not having the resources is not applicable to you, and you might have gone to a school that was majority the same race as the majority of the students you're going to school with, and so you would think their perspective may not be as different, but it might be just because of the past experiences of their families.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And also, I don't know, I mean, I agreed with a lot of what he said.
Which, the Roberts or?
Roberts in the majority decision. However, I do think that, people who grew up, African Americans, Hispanics, there is a different experience, life experiences that they're going to have. Going through the world,
the way people look at you. I had a friend that I became close to, and that I'm still close to, that's of a different race. And I remember we traveled to Louisiana to go visit family, and I'd done that road trip many times with my now husband, boyfriend, and family members, and always had smooth sailing all the way there. I go with her. We go to Denny's. It's her birthday. They had the free meal on your birthday.
Yeah.
We couldn't get seated. We barely finally get seated. We wouldn't get waited on. She didn't want to give her the free breakfast, and because she was black, I mean, they treated her so differently.
Right.
So that definitely gives you like a totally different perspective.
Yeah, interesting.
And it was obvious what the reason was, because having done the same thing, like one time we went to Denny's with my husband and two of his friends who had the same birthday, nobody questioned it.
Yeah, interesting.
But so it definitely,
it's different.
Perspective.
I know my story was when I moved to Boston, I didn't really know many people, but I had a friend, not a close friend, who lived in the area, and we were chatting, and she was like, "What are you doing for New Year's Eve?" And I said, "I don't have any plans." She's like, "Well, I'm going to do first night, and then I'm going to a party. I was invited to a party." I'm like, "Oh, awesome." And she's like, "Do you want to come?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." So we did first night. We were in like jeans and sweaters, and then we went to this very, very high-end part of town. It was like right on Beacon Hill. And it was this beautiful brownstone.
Oh, nice.
And we went in, and we were like the worst dressed people there. But we were also the only white people.
Oh,
and I had no idea that we were going to be the only, everybody else was African American.
Yeah.
And I felt really awkward. I felt like, oh, they don't want me here. And I felt like I stood out, and I felt really insecure. But what I also realized was like they were so nice to me. Like they went out of every person there went out of their way, even though they didn't know me and I was dressed like a slob, to make me feel at home.
Did they think you were homeless? No, I'm kidding.
Probably. No, I think they knew what it felt like.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, God, how many parties have I been to where there were one or two African Americans there, and was I as gracious to them? Probably not.
Yeah.
I wouldn't expect them to feel, insecure.
Yeah.
Because I never lived that. So there is something to that, I think.
But going back to all those factors that I think that the schools also considered, it did mention that they did consider geographical diversity as well. So race seemed to be one of the things that they considered, because they do want to have students from different perspectives, especially like I think in any field, but you think about like the science or engineering field, you want somebody who can think about a solution from a different perspective and come up with a better one or a new one.
Sure. Yeah, it makes total sense.
Yeah.
So let's switch gears just a little bit. What's happening now is with this decision out there, some of the conservative activist groups are now, instituting lawsuits in the private sector against diversity, equity, inclusion programs, many of which have some racial preference elements to them, or at least that's the allegation. And I think that to the extent that they can demonstrate that, the plaintiffs in those cases, they probably will successfully
with this decision
overcome, because I think they're going to have an easier time in the employment context than
it's a different standard
that Harvard and UNC had. It is a different standard. So let's assume, and that, just for the moment, that they're going to win. The plaintiffs are going to win, and in these DEI programs, racial preferences are going to be held invalid, whether it's under the Constitution or Title VII
for employment.
For employment. Does that leave anything left for DEI?
Or for the 14th Amendment? How do you prove discrimination? If you get rid of all of these and you don't let the schools look at what's happening,
if you get rid of the preferences in employment, obviously you still have the ability to bring a claim that you were discriminated against, right? So that remains. The question is,
but how do you now prove it? And if they're prohibited from considering race, I think that this might get to the heart of this decision. Then there's really, how do you prove the negative, that there is no racism in the decision in firing or hiring if they're not allowed to consider it?
I think that the lawsuits for discrimination would be the same. I mean,
no, I don't know with this case. If they win on the employment side, if these plaintiffs, the conservative plaintiffs, win on the employment side, and you're not allowed to consider race in hiring or firing, then how does anybody ever prove, because everybody's supposed to then say, oh yeah, we don't consider it at all. So how do you prove that they did discriminate against you because of your race?
Well, the way you've always done it, which is you show that there's either some overt evidence that you were discriminated against based on race.
This decision is the school said we are going to look, because they were worried about these lawsuits, which I think is why they had that as a factor.
Right.
And I think that's why they kept track of the percentages every year. They showed that in the decision that Harvard and I think UNC would say, oh, we had this percentage of the whole class body that were of this race and that race, and they were trying to make sure they didn't deviate too much from it.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, because they were worried about that.
I think because of that I'm not sure that decision is going to have too much of an impact on the employment front.
Yeah.
Because employers still have to worry about being sued for race-based discrimination. So they do have to keep track of the numbers, right?
But are they now prohibited from doing that if a decision similar to this one is applied to the employers?
I don't think so. I think if let's say they're going to do a layoff and there's...
And you would know more about this because you worked in the HR, human resources, employment sector, and I did. So if you're going to do a layoff and there's 1,000 people and 100 of them are African American, and you're laying off, instead of 10% African Americans, you're laying off, 30%. Then there's evidence of a disparate treatment of the races, and that's a problem. And this decision doesn't stop you from saying, like, hey guys, like, what's going on here? If we go forward with a layoff and this is all devised, we're going to have some real legal actions here. So I think that's why, in some ways, this isn't going to change too much. It just means that you can't give preferences in hiring or promotions based on race. I also think, for the DEI programs, there's a lot of stuff they're doing that really isn't about, who are we hiring, who are we promoting, who are we firing. It's they're promoting that they're doing something and maybe they're not really doing something.
Or that or that they're focusing on where they're recruiting from. You know what I mean? Like, maybe they're saying, look, we have a disparate number of white people. Are we really reaching out to in the market of where people from different races are? And I don't think that this decision is going to prohibit that, or even, in the workplace, once if a person of a protected class comes to work, it's not going to stop the company from making sure that the person is adjusting and thriving and all that. So I think there's some left, but it's definitely going to.
DEI also includes folks with different abilities. or
yeah.
people who are sometimes called disabled.
Yeah.
So you still have that too. And
Yeah.
people forget that a lot of times too.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
So we'll see. I mean, we'll see how those cases play out.
I feel like it's also like a lot of this gets back to just trying to create some empathy, so that people can work together better and not have as many conflicts and feel like, it's one against the other, whether it's whatever it is, class, or if it's race or gender. In some way, I guess I'm a little bit of an idealist, but we have, what they call a loneliness epidemic, where people feel like nobody hears them and nobody has the same problems as them, or people don't understand them. And so in one way, DEI efforts could help with that, with
Sure.
trying to get people to understand, somebody with Asperger's and why they act like they do, for example.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I think that's right. And I don't think it's necessarily that you're, I forgot what you said, optimist or.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I think it's just being a good human being. That a lot of this stuff, like I think, like affirmative action and helping people who are members of classes or groups that have experienced mistreatment. That I don't know if you could fix it with rules and plans and programs and legislation, but it certainly can be fixed with empathy and caring and, just doing a good turn for somebody and recognizing that, some people have had it rough in this world. And it doesn't mean, they're going to get an extra 3 stars, when they apply for a job or apply for admission to a elite college. But maybe it's just, whatever you happen to be doing in your life, you help those people, help them get ahead.
And that gets me back to Scalia. I said he'd come to our school.
Yeah.
It's kind of the same argument he was making. He didn't think we should have all these agencies.
Yeah.
Because shouldn't the businesses and people just know that they should do the right thing? We already have all the laws.
Right.
Which was an interesting perspective. But now that I've been in municipal government and seen how complicated some of these regulations are, and how when the legislators or boards of selectmen or the towns pass things, they don't always know what the repercussions or the
Sure.
Confusing issues will be. But it just gets back to letting people regulate themselves, or feeling like people need a little bit of a nudge because they're not always going to do the right thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good point.
Yeah.
So before we wrap up, do you have any big picture perspective on this that you want to just leave everybody with? Or
Well, I'm a little crestfallen with the decision, to be honest. I don't know where things go from here. I know we now have some ethics standards for the Supreme Court. I hope that they can get back on track and get more of the trust of the public back. It's just not so good right now. It's not only because of the appointments and the way that all of that went, but it's also, making sure that it's clear who is being influenced by whom, or who's donating what to whom, so that everything's out in the open.
Yeah.
So,
well, good. Okay. Well, I'll give you the last word on that.
Okay, great.
So thank you, and hopefully we'll see you soon. So
Great.
Thank you very much.